Hello and welcome to Lesson 3. This week we are talking all about giving yourself unconditional permission to eat all foods. This is easily one of the most vital parts of intuitive eating because the only way to fully let go of restricting is to give yourself full permission to eat. As you navigate through this lesson, please remember to be patient with yourself. You didn't learn all these negative beliefs about food overnight. So it's really unrealistic to think that you'll be able to unlearn it all quickly. This is a whole process and quite the journey that you've embarked on here. I am excited for you to learn these techniques to help you heal your relationship with food. And I feel so much gratitude that you have trusted me to teach you all about this journey. Before we dive right into the lesson, here are the learning objectives for today. I'm first going to explain what exactly I mean by unconditional permission to eat all foods. It is pretty self-explanatory, but that statement by itself tends to bring up some feelings of anxiety within some people. Maybe you've noticed that within yourself. So we'll cover off what exactly unconditional permission to eat means and also why it is so important. Next, we'll go over something called the dietary restraint theory, which describes what happens when dieters go off their diet and break their food rules. You'll likely be able to relate to the different eating patterns that I'll mention here. Then we will touch on mental restriction a bit more deeply. Mental restriction is so sneaky and something that people tend to struggle with long after they've stopped physically restricting their food. So I'll explain it a bit more here, and then also give you some tips on how to help overcome mental restriction. We'll then touch on habituation. This is essentially what happens when you do give yourself unconditional permission to eat all foods, and it's a wonderful thing. Finally, I'm going to talk about fear foods or forbidden foods, whichever term speaks more to you. They are essentially the exact same thing. Foods that you have come to believe are forbidden and fear what may happen if you do eat them. We're also going to do an exercise to help you habituate to these foods so that the novelty is lost with them. First, I'd like for you to complete the Peace with Food assessment handout. Don't worry about if you answer no to every question. This is not a pass or fail quiz or anything like that. This is simply meant to give you a more clear idea of the areas that you need to really focus on working through. And if it's literally every area, that's totally fine. Just start where you're at and remember to always remain patient with yourself through this journey. Also, please note that since we are just at lesson 3 of 8, there's obviously a lot left for us to cover. So there are questions on this assessment that are speaking to areas of intuitive eating that we have yet to go over. Keep this assessment hand in hand and do it again in a few weeks to see just how far you've come. All right, let's dive into unconditional permission to eat all foods now, shall we? The reason that unconditional permission to eat all foods is so vital is that anytime you are deprived of something that you like or need, you begin to long for it and you want it even more. Cravings run rampant as soon as we're restricted from any kind of substance, whether it is clothing, fresh air, scenery, or especially food. In the Intuitive Eating 4th edition book by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch, they talked about scientists living in Biosphere 2, which is an airtight glass enclosed terrarium. After being enclosed in this space for 2 years, the scientists talked about how they had been actually fantasizing about the fresh air they'd experience once they got out. They also experienced cravings for their favorite foods that were not available to them while in this self-imposed captivity. The research team actually had more to say about the food than science at their press conference, and one of them even ended up writing a cookbook. The scientists had described cravings for food that began to occupy their thoughts. It's just another example of the deprivation effect. And while this may seem extreme, because, well, it is, the same thing happens when we put self-imposed limits and restraints on food. You have the ability to drive to the store and grab that bag of chips that you're truly wanting right now. But yet choosing not to, simply because you are restricting the chips currently, is perceived by the brain as the same kind of restriction that these scientists face, or that the men in the Minnesota starvation experiment faced. See, your brain and body cannot distinguish between forced restriction due to actual lack of food and not having access to the food, and self-imposed restriction due to trying to lose weight. Your body will react to both forms of restriction in the exact same way, by slowing the metabolism, releasing more hunger hormones and fewer satiety hormones, and causing you to become fixated on food. Unconditional permission to eat means that you remove any and all self-imposed restraints around food. Obviously, this does not include any real allergies or intolerances or anything like that. I don't consider that a self-imposed restraint. That's obviously a whole other thing. Remember that the main goal of intuitive eating is to ultimately get to a place where you are better able to honor and respect your body. And we ultimately want to ensure that we are prioritizing both physical and mental health here as well. So when we talk about unconditional permission to eat, we mean that there are no judgments around food. No matter what you choose to eat, when or how much you eat, there is no judging yourself. You'll notice that the cognitive flexibility and changing your mind handouts from week 1 are attached to this lesson as well. This is a great time to practice these methods for reframing your unhelpful beliefs around food as they arise. So when you notice a judgment pop up around what you ate, how much or when, simply utilize one of these reframing techniques to remind yourself that there's no judgment here, and you are simply doing what you need to do and honoring your body, your hunger, your taste buds, and yourself. The next thing with developing peace with food is letting go of any preconceived notions about a certain food being bad or inherently unhealthy. This is such a problem in our current society that I'm going to dive deeper into this point on the next slide. Ultimately, it is important when developing this unconditional permission to eat all foods to remember that no one food or one meal is going to immediately affect your health. This even goes for whenever you hear bold claims that a single food or ingredient causes inflammation in the body. Data shows that no single food or ingredient in just one serving has the ability to do this. So whereas overall dietary patterns over time can absolutely have an effect on your health and things like inflammation in the body, there's no one-off food that can truly impact your health in a single dose. Now, but aren't certain foods or ingredients inherently unhealthy? Let's look a little bit deeper at the overarching belief that certain foods are inherently unhealthy. Here are 2 mindset switches for you if you really struggle with this belief around certain foods being bad or unhealthy. First, no one food in a single dose has the ability to cause you ill health or better health, right? Like, I think that is something that we can all pretty easily wrap our heads around. Even the most extreme dieters out there who preach about how we need to avoid certain foods or ingredients I think even they can and will agree to the fact that there is no one food in a single dose that will immediately cause you ill health or better health. The fact is that one donut is not going to immediately cause you to become ill, just like one piece of spinach is not going to immediately cause you to be super healthy. The next thing to factor in when talking about food and health is the impacts on mental health as well. What do I mean by this? Well, say you're feeling extremely stressed. Your cortisol, that's the stress hormone, levels are high, and your sympathetic nervous system, remember we talked about that last week, is engaged. Essentially, you're in that state of fight, flight, or freeze. As we've previously discussed, it is really hard on the body to be in this state for extended periods of time. Food has the ability to trigger the release of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is the feel-good hormone that also helps to decrease cortisol and stress levels. So if having an ice cream sundae at the end of a particularly rough day, is going to help you feel at least a little bit more relaxed and help you to lower your stress levels slightly, is that not healthy then? The issue with mainstream diet and health industry is that they seem to focus so much on physical health that they disregard mental health. The mental health effects of food restriction are huge. Here's an example. In a stressed moment, you may crave an ice cream sundae. You can either have that ice cream sundae, which will then trigger the release of dopamine in the brain, lowering cortisol levels and helping engage the parasympathetic nervous system. That's the rest and digest mode that we long for. Alternatively, you can deny yourself that sundae, telling yourself that it's bad and unhealthy, which will lead to more stress, because how freaking stressful is telling yourself that you cannot eat something that you really want. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that you should always turn to food to help yourself de-stress. We do dive deeper into emotional eating in the coming weeks, but a large part of making peace with food is in allowing yourself to emotionally eat if you want to. Also, let's not forget the fact that dieting can lead to, and does for a lot of people, I know it did for me, and maybe you have a similar experience, but it can lead to higher feelings of anxiety and depression as well.